Okay, well, thank you all. I think as people are filing in, I'll get started. Thank you all for joining us this evening for the book launch and talk on the sexual politics of Black churches, edited by my colleague Josef Sorett. I'm really grateful to you all for joining us to celebrate this book on a day which wasn't planned, but historic with respect to Justice Jackson's confirmation on the Supreme Court. I know we're not talking about the Supreme Court, but I think nevertheless some of the issues raised in this book will be relevant before Justice Jackson in the coming years, and just wanted to mention that. But my name is Matthew Engelke. I'm the director of IRCPL, and in that role, I get to edit the book series. And it's been a real pleasure seeing this particular volume come to fruition. And we have tonight with us some of the contributors and interlocutors with whom Josef has been engaging over the past several years. I'm going to just do a few words of housekeeping and then introduce our chair for this evening, Professor Barbara Savage. Just so you all know, this is a webinar format Zoom. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. We are going to be running until just after 6 p.m. tonight. There will be time for questions after the participants offer their commentaries. At any time during the webinar, you are very welcome to pose your questions. At the bottom of your Zoom box, you should see a Q&A function. Please feel free to type your questions into that. You don't have to wait until the Q&A session, and the chair will be able to see and read your questions out loud. You can either identify yourself with your name, or you can ask your question anonymously. It's entirely up to you. The only other thing I wanted to mention is just to offer my thanks for the staff at IRCPL for making this happen, especially Madeline De Jesus, who's behind the scenes tonight working on the webinar, but also to our colleague Waleed Hammam, and our recent colleague Mariana Pecoraro, who is moving on to other exciting roles within the university, but has been playing a central part for IRCPL over the past few years. So thanks to the three of them, all of whom had a very important role in making this event possible. I want to move on now to introduce Professor Barbara Savage, who is both chairing and then also participating in the conversation. Professor Savage is the Geraldine R. Siegel Professor of American Social Thought at the University of Pennsylvania in the Department of Africana Studies. She is the author of a number of works, to include the monograph, Your Spirits Walk Beside Us, The Politics of Black Religion. I believe that was Harvard University Press, and also Broadcasting Freedom, Radio War and the Politics of Race, 1938 to 1948 with UNC Chapel Hill. So it's a pleasure to welcome Professor Savage, who I'm going to now turn it over to, and thank you again all for joining us this evening. Oh, you're muted still.
Oh man, can't trust me with the technology. Thank you, Matthew,
No,
and thanks to all of you who are joining us, and certainly thanks to Madeline and Waleed, who have helped get us through this in terms of logistics. And so I also want to start by certainly thanking Josef for his leadership, which is what brings us to both this book and the conversation that we intend to have tonight. I will introduce my fellow panelists, as it were, and then we will move right into some remarks and discussions among ourselves, and have plenty of time left for questions and answers, we hope, from those of you who are listening, and we're asking you to use the Q&A function for that. So I will turn to introductions first, and our just in alphabetical order. Brad Braxton is going to be with us. Always nice to see Brad. He's the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at St. Luke's School in New York. He's also the founder of the Open Church in Baltimore and is a curatorial advisor for Creative Encounters, Living Religions in the United States, which is the 2023 Smithsonian Folklife Festival on Religious Diversity. So we'll have a chance to see that.
Yes.
Yeah, good. He holds a PhD in New Testament studies from Emory University and was a Rhodes Scholar at the University of Oxford. So we look forward to hearing from Brad. Nyasha Jr. is an associate professor in the Department of Religious Studies at Temple University, also here in rainy Philadelphia. Her research and teaching focus is on religion, race, and gender. She's the author of An Introduction to Womanist Biblical Interpretation, which came out in 2015, and Reimagining Hagar, Blackness and the Bible in 2019, and co-author of Black Samson, the untold story of an American icon, which I think is peeking at us over her shoulder. And then finally, Josef Sorett, who is professor of religion and African-American and African diasporic studies at Columbia University. He's currently the chair of the Department of Religion and directs the Center on African-American Religion, Sexual Politics, and Social Justice. He's the author of two books, Spirit in the Dark, A Religious History of Racial Aesthetics, which came out in 2016, and the forthcoming The Holy, Holy Black, The Ironies of an American Secular. So we're really looking forward to this conversation. And I want to say how privileged I feel to be a part of this, as having been a part of one of the earlier iterations of this project, which has brought this book forward. And that is the work that Josef led as part of the Center on African-American Religion, Sexual Politics, and Social Justice, which is an initiative that Brad and I were both privileged to be a part of. And we were able to participate in many conversations over the last decade, because it's actually been quite that long. And I think it's one of the projects that I'm most happy to have been a part of, and from which I learned the most, but also felt most at home, in the sense of a project that actually brought together many facets of me, of myself, both personally and professionally, and brought me together in various spaces with people who share a lot of my own sort of personal and professional interests. It was as ecumenical a group as possible, and I mean that both in terms of the academics who were involved in the earlier projects, folks who work in the humanities and social sciences, but also in religious studies and theology, biblical scholars, history and Black studies, but also pastors and practitioners, church people, professionals. And it really brought us together to discuss the questions that we're actually going to be returning to tonight. And that has to do with issues affecting LGBTQ people in Black religious communities. And I say this as a Black queer woman who is both religious and spiritual, as we are often making that distinction these days, but I try to claim both of those. And so it is a project that I remember with gratitude for the grace and love and care within it, and that was always around us as we approach this work together. And that's a spirit that informs this text that we're going to talk about tonight, and I think the people who are gathered here now on this panel. So I think one of the consequences of my pandemic brain fog is that even though I have seen iterations of drafts, and I was actually at the earliest, a couple of both the conversations and earlier gatherings, I was actually able to give the book a really fresh read, in part because my memory has faded. And I want to say how exciting it is to see it in text and how well it holds up, both against the test of time, but also how powerful and timely the work is today. And I think we'll learn more about that as we move along. So I think, having just said that, and I'll feel free to, to come back and say more. But I thought we would open up by asking Josef if he wanted to start, and then we'll turn to Nyasha and Brad. And each will have a chance to say whatever it is that they wish to say, and then I'll try to moderate some discussion among the three or four of us. Josef?
Sure, yes. Thank you, Barbara, for that introduction. I'm realizing now, just as I start to talk, that I didn't bring a glass or bottle of water. Things you forget to do when you're not in person. Yeah, so well, things I forget to do, I should say, right? They're not what everyone else forgets to do. But yeah, let me begin, and I won't go too long, but I do want to also echo gratitude to Matthew and the IRCPL team, Walid, Madeline, and Mariana, for making this event happen, even more for the support of the book, right? As it comes out as one of the latest book in IRCPL's Religion, Culture, and Public Life series with Columbia University Press. Should also thank the team at the press for their support of the work. And I see both Wendy, the editor, religion editor, and Lowell, who helped with production. So appreciate the team at the press for being here and for supporting the work, getting forward. I'm sure I'm overlooking someone there else who may be here today. And also just as Barbara, you alluded in your comments, this book has been a long time coming. We first gathered at Union Theological Seminary in July of 2010. And here we are now in April of 2022. And so the book also found support early, but from previous directors of IRCPL, including Karen Barkey and Mark Taylor, who first embraced the idea. And I appreciate that Matthew helped us make it to the finish line with the press here to see it in the world. I want to thank again also Brad, Barbara, and Nyasha for agreeing to do this event. That we have I think about a total between the conversations in the book and the single authored chapters, there's about 18 different contributors. And I think we have tonight both two of the core advisors who were there from the outset, Brad and Barbara, right? One of the transitions that create sadness with the book coming out is, we haven't been meeting with the same sort of regularity that made the book possible. And so it's good to be with you this evening. And then Nyasha, as one who joined the project a little later, who really added, her chapter added something unique that reflected the evolution of the debates that I maybe want to say a little about, and really, I think, broadened what the book is trying to do in speaking to a range of different audiences. So thank you for the three of you for agreeing to be here this evening. One thing that I think is central both to expressing gratitude, but also to the substance of the book that Barbara, you also began to speak to, that is very much a community affair. This is the case with anthologies in general, right? As the editor can never claim ownership over all the arguments. But this book itself really, or all the work that went into it, this book really emerged in the context of a set of conversations that I think all of us were privy to participate in. And so I want to just acknowledge the community of folks that led to the book, but also to the Center on African American Religion, Sexual Politics, and Social Justice. That was part of what made this book possible, that community of folks, all of whom I can't name now in the multiple iterations of the conversations. And then especially also key staff who helped make the center go and continue to, and I see him in attendance, Reverend Dr. Derek McQueen, who is the Associate Director at CARS and also interviews Dennis and Christine Wiley in the final chapter of the book. So Derek, want to acknowledge you as well. And then just two last words of thanks, both the Arcus Foundation and the Carpenter Foundation, who supported the work for the book over the long haul. And last, the folks who blurbed the book, the folk who are joined at the last minute just to provide a book with a special kind of blessing, one might say, in light of whatever context we might be. So thanks to Anthony, Jeffrey, Kelly, Lerone, Marla, Nikki, and of course, Bishop Yvette Flunder, who has been a conversation partner and a collaborator throughout the way. So now to the substance of the book, I'm going to be even more brief and just say a couple things, right, that speaks to the context. And part of what I think our invitation in thinking about it today over the long haul is, on one hand, the evolution of a set of debates around the question of sexual difference in the context of Black communities, but also the very specific juxtaposition of where we were then, right, in 2010, and what was driving the conversation then and where we are now, right? So when the book was the run-up to those first set of conversations were debates around marriage. And in fact, an early iteration of the convening that took place prior to our gathering in 2010 took place in Philadelphia at Public-Private Ventures at the conclusion of a study that was grounded in several conversations that I was fortunate to have across the country with a range of Black churches around how they were thinking about marriage equality, or as it was then referred to, same-sex marriage, right? Leading up to Prop 8 in California, of course, its passage in November 2008, also being the same day when Obama was elected. And there were a set of concerns and anxieties about marriage, as it were, in the ways in which Black churches were imagined to be an impediment or a problem, if we all recall, right? That Black churches were understood or imagined as standing in the way as a marriage equality movement was growing at the time, right? And that was at least the initial narrative that rolled out after Prop 8's initial passage in California, Prop 8's passage in California in 2008, right? That it was Black churches that prevented this because Black folk overwhelmingly voted, and they voted out of a commitment to their churches and a particular kind of Christian orthodoxy that was understood in opposition to marriage equality or the full inclusion of LGBTQ folks in the life of the church or in American society. Of course, a set of more complicated accounts of what happened on November in 2008 subsequently came out, right? About the bankrolling of those campaigns by the religious right, about the evangelicalism, about the Mormon church that were, right, very much invested, which opens up a set of questions about not just the Black church as the problem, but the degree to which Christian churches more broadly, American Christianity, and the religious right in particular, in an investment in an interlocking set of logics around race, gender, and sexual orientation, right? And in the face of what we might describe as a shifting sexual order. And the degree to which marriage was and was not the problem that brought us together, right? I recall our earliest conversations where a lot of it was about how marriage was not, it would seem to be the most pressing issue that was facing Black LGBTQ folk, right? So the degree to which marriage created the impetus for us getting together, but wasn't necessarily the question driving all of our conversations around Black churches in the communities they serve, right? So wanted to think about what it means for that to be the context in which our conversations took place and what that meant for setting a trajectory for the book. And again, to acknowledge Arcus's attempt to very much motivated in shifting the logics around marriage, but had the foresight for the conversation, to support conversations that were not bounded in a neat way by that particular policy question, right? And then the flash forward 14 years following the achievement of marriage equality, and right, we can think about the ending of DOMA and set of legislation that also coincided with the gutting of certain kinds of voting rights, civil rights legislation in 2014 and 15, and what that meant for what had been earlier positioned as sort of gay versus Black, or is gay the new Black, right? Instead of debates around race versus gender and sexuality, which we know is on its face a sort of false proposition, right? Much could be said about that. The emergence of a set of claims for exclusion under the guise of appeals to religious freedom. We could think more recently of the Equality Act, right? And the sort of legacy of these kinds of conversations in the current moment, or even most recently in Florida, the Don't Say Gay bill, right? So it's not as if these questions have disappeared, right? But they're shifting in different ways. And we can think of even debates within the AME Church over the last couple of years about what sort of policy implications for thinking around questions of gender and sexual difference that is present all the while within the context of Black churches. And what I guess just say very briefly to wrap this up, and thinking about what does it mean for a book that was originally envisioned in 2008 and comes out now, when the debate has shifted. A couple things that I think we were trying to keep in conversation throughout the chapters, throughout the conversations, and are no less relevant, which is to say, what is the relationship between electoral politics in general and the cultural politics of Black churches specifically, right? How do we hold those things together in thinking about the sexual politics of Black churches, right? What is the relationship between the Black church? I think, right, the longstanding thesis of Black communities as constituting a nation within a nation, but also James Melvin Washington's sort of reimagining of that script and making the claim that Black churches, in particular Black Baptist churches at the turn of the 20th century, as constituting a church with the soul of a nation, right? What does it mean for thinking about American democracy within the context of Black churches? And then also, and some ways, right, the difficulty of this task, so I don't want to claim that the book achieves this, but we're wrestling with what does it mean to try to intervene in the academic field, but also participate in a public debate, right? And this, I think, was one of the exciting opportunities of the invitation back then, but is no less significant now, right? So how do we do that? So I could go on. I think that what I've tried to outline here is perhaps more eloquently and certainly in longer form represented in the introduction and the afterword to the book, which was really a privilege over the long haul. And I appreciate the trust that all the contributors gave to me throughout that process and sticking with the volume. So I'm gonna shut up. And I think, Barbara, do I hand it back to you or do I hand it over to?
I'll take it for a minute and then we'll ask Nyasha to say her piece here. But I also want to say that the introduction to the volume, for those of you who have not yet seen the book, is a masterful and nuanced accounting of that period from 2008 to where we are now, both in the life of the project, but also in the life of the politics, very complex politics around these issues that we've all witnessed since. So, but thank you for the hurry up version of that, Josef, and we'll move on to Nyasha.
Good evening, everyone. I'm really glad to be with you. As everyone knows, I mean, it would be fantastic for us to all be together in person, but I'm glad that we can gather together and celebrate this fantastic book. So I'm just going to offer a few really brief comments about my chapter and talk a little bit about how the conversation has evolved or not. My essay in the volume is titled Jephthah's Daughter and #say her name. Jephthah's daughter appears in Judges chapter 11. This text is the story of how the unnamed daughter of Jephthah is sacrificed. She is the daughter of Jephthah, a judge in Israel. In my essay, I contrast Judges 11 with Genesis 22, the more well-known text on the binding of Isaac, in which Abraham nearly sacrifices his son, but miraculously, in the end, a ram serves as the sacrifice. I used the #say her name campaign as a way to highlight some of the questions involved in a comparison of these two texts. In 2015, the Say Her Name campaign was launched by the African American Policy Forum, which was founded by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw. It aims to document the disproportionate police brutality experienced by Black women and girls. I wrote the chapter around 2019 in part based on comments at an earlier CARS event at Mother Bethel AME in Philadelphia. So what has changed since I initially wrote the essay? I would say nothing. When I do teach Jephthah's Daughter, many students still want to redeem the text. They are anxious for it to not be a text of terror. They are still looking for one authorized biblical interpreter to tell them the one authorized right way to understand biblical text, which largely their leadership has trained them to do. Another thing that has not changed is the number of students, including Christian students, particularly Protestant students, who are utterly shocked by even the existence of biblical texts that are outside of the usual standard repertoire of their priests or pastors. In the essay's conclusion, I ask, why don't we know this text? And this continues to be a question that I pose. Similarly, the essay by my New Testament colleague, Michael Joseph Brown, lifts up basic 101 level information about the importance of historical context. I'm not talking about larger questions of the church and the academy, but in many Black churches, and they are not alone, basic biblical content is not taught, and certainly not information about canonization and composition. Furthermore, in many of these churches, we are talking about folks who have pastors who are seminary trained. So looking at the volume as a whole, I see how the institution of the Black church still matters and still very much has power. In particular, as raised by Dr. Braxton, what pastor says is what goes. Especially in many Black churches, the decisions about which texts are preached rest in the hands of the pastor, who often has full and free autonomy regarding who is allowed in the pulpit and what is preached across that pulpit. Black church pastors are not the only ones who are preaching, however. As noted in the chapter by Dr. Moultrie, there are also women speaking outside of traditional structures. In addition, there are some innovative interventions in what we might call public theology, especially among Black Christian women. For example, Christina Cleveland, Candace Simpson and Fish Sandwich Heaven, Tricia Hershey and the Nap Ministry, as well as numerous podcasts, YouTube channels, and so-called syllabi or book lists. Yet the center still holds as many of these alternative voices remain marginalized. In conclusion, I'll just reiterate that leadership still very much matters, and often in Black churches, the authority still resides with the pastor. Until such pastors change or their authority changes, we will continue to have people in the pews with limited knowledge of these so-called texts of terror and who hold limited views of the ways that biblical texts can be interpreted. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And for those of you who will read this chapter, a very powerful gender analysis around violence and sexuality, which is a really crucial part of this volume. So thank you for that, and we'll certainly circle back and have more to say. Brad, you want to take it from here? Say a little bit for us? Sure.
I have spent the last 20 years in one form or another, preaching, teaching preaching, and evaluating a lot of preaching. And we preachers are often known for hyperbole, but I want to begin by saying it is not in any way hyperbole when I say how much being affiliated with this project from its earliest iterations at what was the Desmond Tutu Center when we met back in 2010 to this very moment, how much a part of my intellectual growth and spiritual maturation this has been. And so I am delighted to be with you this evening and to reconnect, not just with my colleagues and friends, but with folks who have become part of my family. The title of my chapter in the book is Aiding and Abetting New Life, Sex Talk in the Pulpit, Pew, and Public Square. Precisely because I have spent more than 20 years preaching, teaching preaching, and evaluating a lot of preaching, I felt a particular burden, and I mean that in the best sense of that term, a weightiness, when I sat there in that conversation in the Tutu Center in 2010. There were some other practical theologians and homileticians and pastors there, and perhaps they were thinking the same thing that I was thinking. And here's what I was thinking. The theoretical conversations are rich. They were replete in the atmosphere. And yet over and over and over again, I just kept saying to myself, how do we bring this down on the ground? And I felt that that was one of my responsibilities throughout the arc of this project, is to always say, how do we get it? And my family members on this call will know that I would always use this phrase in our conversations. How do we get it to mama and them? How do we make sure that Ray and and Pookie and Mrs. Johnson, who is the usher, who ushers on the third Sunday? How do we make sure that these theoretically rich conversations get to mama and them? And I know this is an Ivy League conversation, but I promise you, every community, every neighborhood, every ethnic group has some mama and thems, right? Where we just need to realize we gotta keep it real and make sure we put our best thinking into go boxes so that our best thinking actually gets out into the public sphere. In that regard, there are three just simple nuggets that I want to share with you as I have reflected on the book in toto and whatever small contributions I was able to make to it. And the first is a neologism. It is a word that I use often now, a word that was given to me by one of our village elders, the Reverend Dr. James A. Forbes Jr., the senior minister emeritus at the Riverside Church, one of my dearest friends and mentors. And he was the first one I heard use this word. He may not have coined it, but I always give him credit because I learned it from him. And that is the word tangibilitating. That what I attempted to do in my essay was to, just as I said, take these theoretically rich conversations and tangibilitate them, bring them down on the ground, put them in our bodies, and help us to think about how do we get a radically inclusive ethic into the souls and bodies of people. And I decided to use practical theology because practical theology is a fleshly affair. Practical theology, conversations about how people's bodies act and interact with their beliefs. And so as we go forward in this conversation, especially trying to tangibilitate an inclusive ethic, especially as it relates to LGBTQ colleagues, family members, friends, we must always think about taking that which is theoretically rich and making sure it gets into people's bodies so they can enact it in their daily lives. As I attempted to tangibilitate a radically inclusive ethic in my contribution in the chapter, it was also important for me to try to widen just a bit the aperture so that in the conversations, we weren't simply talking about, as we were all deeply committed to, the moral and civic equality of LGBTQ persons, but also to help all of us learn how to talk more competently and compassionately about sexuality in general. There is a line I wrote in page 178 where I said, the pastoral task of making love requires an affirmation of diversity. The phrase making love should not be reduced exclusively to erotic activity. So while in the chapter, I was specifically thinking about practical tasks, particularly in the ways in which they manifest themselves in church life and among church people, I was also interested in helping us to realize that making love is what the church in its best is supposed to be about in general. Second, as I attempted to offer contributions to this book, it was important for me to realize and to help others realize we need to be careful when we use the phrase, oh, that's just words. It's never more, it should always be more, I should say, than just words. How we talk about the most significant moral matters of the day is itself a moral matter. So at the conclusion of my chapter, I offer what I call rules of engagement. And quite literally, those rules of engagement were first deployed in 2003 when there had been an incident of homophobic violence at Morehouse College, and the dean of the Martin Luther King Chapel there, Dean Lawrence Carter, another one of my mentors, invited me to come down, and we had a large public gathering as we began to talk about an ethic that would help us reduce this kind of violence. And the Rules of engagement that are at the end of the chapter literally came as I moderated a large public gathering, and the heat in that moment was so intense. But those rules have helped me on so many occasions, simple rules about charitable conversations, compassionate conversations, hospitable conversations. So hopefully, as we go forward, we will take from this volume the notion that it is never just words. We, however, should be committed to speaking just words, equitable words, healing words, life-giving words. So tangibilitating, number one, it's always more than just words. It should be about just words. Number two, and then finally, I'm heartened because this volume, even amid the arc of its production, remains so relevant. So I want to conclude by thinking about the relevance amid the retrenchment. As Josef so rightly said, there is retrenchment in the land, whether it is these legislative moves to prevent meaningful conversations with young people in their schoolhouses about sexual diversity, or whether it is the epidemic of violence against trans members of our communities and families. Retrenchment is in the land. And so we must remember, as Emily Towns, who was one of our panelists at that brilliant 2014 launching, Emily Towns says that evil is a society's capacity to produce misery and suffering. So evil is still among us. And I do not mean that in some metaphysical way. I mean that in the most profound sociological way. Given that evil is trying to retrench itself and take back all of our gains, we must maintain a spirit of resistance. And so I conclude my comments by saying, I wanted to be a part of this because I'm going all the way with this. And it's so delightful to be with colleagues who have that kind of commitment. And I know the family members here will remember that just by happenstance, I became the kind of unofficial chaplain in many of our meetings. I don't know why they wanted me to be the chaplain, because I got all kinds of issues I'm still trying to work through, but I was the chaplain and often centered us, and we did a lot of wonderful centering things, and especially we did a whole lot of singing, a whole lot of singing. So I got to be authentic. When I talk about relevance and resistance amid retrenchment, here's what I heard the ancestors said I had to do to close my comments. Where there is no music, the spirit will not come, the spirit of resistance, the spirit of radically inclusive love. So I conclude my comments, and I look forward to our further dialogue by saying this. Done made my vow to the Lord, and I won't turn back. I will go, I shall go to see what the end will be. Those of us who have been a part of this project, we made a vow to the Lord. We opened our mouths to the ancestors, and we said, we want better communities, more equitable communities, more radically inclusive communities. And now, y'all, since we done opened our mouth to the Lord and said we're gonna do this, the ancestors said, y'all gotta run on.
All right, and see what the end's gonna be. All right, that is about as fitting a way to conclude. And also, I think to give those of you who are listening a sense of the power of the gatherings that we did have over the number of years that we were meeting together. And in every way, it was a very unusual set of gatherings, unusual set of people around the same table. And that's what made it really rich. So thanks to the three of you. Josef, do you want to say anything else by way of describing the rest of the volume? And we've touched on a couple of things here, but for the benefit of folks who may not have seen the book yet. And I guess I am also to offer up a plug that in the chat room, there is a 20% discount on the book, should you be interested in getting a copy. But Josef, do you want to say something else? Because and we already have a couple of questions in the Q&A, and I'd like us to go ahead and move to that after you say something brief here.
I mean, I could just say very briefly, right, that and Barbara, your own participation in the book as a participant in the opening conversation is slightly different in this regard. Yes. In terms of not being an author, but between Brad, whose presentation today and chapter speaks at sort of the intersection of practical theology and preaching, and Nyasha's, who within the world of biblical studies, what the book does as a whole is really try to map that the interdisciplinary conversation that was on display at that meeting at the Tutu Center and moving forward. And so it's organized into sections as between like thinking about sacred texts, then to sort of more historical and cultural approaches, right? And I think it's chapters by Wallace Best on Clarence Cobb, Jonathan Walton on Afro-phallic Protestantism, Monique Moultrie on televangelism, right? So we're moving from ethicists to historians, to political scientists like Melinda Price and Columbia colleague, social psychologist Valerie Purdy Vaughn. And then the book moves more in the direction of what Brad has described rightfully as practical, right? So we try to move from the theoretical, whether that's close analysis of texts or of context, vis-a-vis history, if you will, to preaching and theology, right? So Monica Coleman taking up the question of gay versus Black, right? Arguing that gay is the new Black, theologically speaking, at the moment, right? And then ultimately the book returns to, right, the model of conversation, attempting to model what we're arguing for. So it begins with this wonderful conversation between Barbara, Victor Anderson, Serene Jones, with Kathy Cohn and I moderating, and then ends with a conversation in the context of the pastorate, with Derek McQueen interviewing in conversation with Dennis and Christine Wiley, who were, right, pastors of a historically Black congregation and on the front lines of marriage equality in the context of DC. So the book is trying to move into disciplinary ways, but also moving from academic to the public context, in particular, the context of the congregation. So hopefully that gives a little bit of sense of the broader scope. And yeah, it'd be great to hear what folks are thinking and what the questions are.
All right, so I'm going to move to that, and I'm going to compress this a little bit. And I will read this because I think it captures a question that's important. Help me understand this. This is me reading the question. Black community has been welcoming LGBTQRIFT2S people when the white community was shunning their gay children and putting them out of their families. I'm paraphrasing. James Baldwin and many others, highly revered in civil rights movement. I would add Braxton as well. When the AIDS epidemic occurred, Black communities tried to find ways to address that, though not uniformly. So when is it, this is the question, that the Black community, or how is it that the Black community becomes a poster child or the poster community of what you call, Josef, hyper-homophobia? And that's a historical question, I think, as well as, and so I just put that to the panel, but that's a question that came into the forum. Josef?
Oh,
or
well, I mean,
Nyasha, whoever, Brad, whoever.
I'm happy to answer, but I would defer to my colleagues on the panel,
Okay,
and I'm
great.
glad to jump in. Yeah.
Okay.
I'll just offer this quick observation that comes to my mind. I am mindful of that wonderful work on the history of Black biblical engagement that Vincent Wimbush has offered us. And one of the things that he charts there is the rise of fundamentalism among Black Christian communities in the early 20th century. And so I do want to just note that there were ways of being religious that involved syncretism, what we often call syncretism, and merging and mixing and flexibility that came with us from the African continent and other diasporic ways. And then there was a increasing adoption of very rigid ways of thinking about religion and text that then began to creep into various forms of how we began to characterize Christianity, very much in segments of the early and mid 20th century. So I do want to note that as one of the phenomenon that occurred is how fundamentalism begins to co-opt and seep into aspects of Black Christianity.
And I'll also say that this book, and Josef makes this point in the introduction, and then Nyasha, you can join in here, that the intersection between race, religion, and politics, meaning electoral politics, and also the kind of polling that is, that is a part of that, has also added to this perception and added a kind of scientific aura to it, if you will. And that has also been a part of what has gone on. And part of it is also related to the power of Black churches, the perceived power of Black churches in the Democratic Party. And so it's received as a surprise that Black people who are perceived as being liberal on certain sets of issues would in some ways be conservative and wrong in others. And also the further point that the Black church representations do not allow for the kind of diversity that exists among us, and also does not really address issues having to do with the presence of evangelical beliefs. Nyasha?
I was just going to make a similar point that I think one of the things the book does very well is capture that diversity and acknowledges how, when we talk about race, religion, and electoral politics, that frequently in the media, Black church is understood as a monolith. And so one of the things that the book, I think, does very well is to speak more about the diversity within Black churches.
Josef, do you want to follow on this?
I mean, I guess I really appreciate, I'll be brief. I appreciate Brad's point in pointing to that sort of how Black churches negotiate the modernist fundamentalist split, right? And to what degree, where the early 20th century. And then in more recent years, we can think about the degree to which the religious right has dominated discourse on what real Christianity or what real religion is. And within that space, how a segment of Black preachers have been enfolded as part of the religious right, perhaps given more prominence, right, and spoke up in very powerful ways, one might say, about an opposition to marriage, but we're not representative of that broader movement or of the Black church, right? And I think that in a certain way, one could think about the relationship between that narrative and the degree to which broader national anxieties about gender and sexuality have often been projected onto Black folk rather than addressing them in full, right? So there's a way, not only just the hyper homophobia, but Black churches become the hyperphobic boogeyman when in fact, right, white denominations are splitting over the question of gender and sexual difference, right? So that one could apply this, Lonnie Gunair uses the language of the miner's canary to think about what's going on with Black folk is emblematic more broadly about the nation. And so Black churches become the space to have the conversation when it is, I think, a broader national conversation. And I think to the other point about how Black churches have often had a tradition of inclusion, one of the comments that came up in many of our conversations was that, right, before Clinton coins a policy around don't ask, don't tell, that sort of the reality of sexual difference in Black churches and Black communities was long acknowledged, right? Wallace Best's chapter on Clarence Cobb called attention to this, right? Amongst other places, and that Black churches have cultivated a range of strategies for talking publicly in ways that allow for that difference to be held together under the rubrics of Black church, right? And often it would seem that a public profession of something that sounds quite conservative allows for the space for different kinds of diversity to flourish underneath that public profession. But I'll stop there.
I think one of the questions also that I would ask us in the time that we have remaining, has to do with the usefulness of this book. Certainly, we can imagine its usefulness to our students and our colleagues in the academic and the various academic fields that we've touched on before. But how can we imagine this book being useful to people who are in pulpits and who are in pews and who are religious, and perhaps even in the ways in which will this book teach can this book preach? To kind of I'm not trying to be Brad, but to just raise the question about about broader audiences and how this message can be spread out inside and outside of academic settings.
Thank you for that, Barbara. The short answer is yes, 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 it can. And one of the realities of this world in which we find ourselves now, in terms of how Zooming and teleconferencing is just a part of how we live, I think there are enhanced opportunities to think about how we are marketing the book, and maybe some of us can offer ourselves, that what if each contributor offered himself, herself, themselves as available at some point to various groups and conferences to say, I will Zoom in for 30 minutes and walk you through some of what we were trying to do when we did this, in a way that would be much more difficult if we were trying to fly folks all over the world. So even this online format can help the book to get into the grassroots in ways that I know we always envisioned.
I think one of the other questions is, in looking at any book, and certainly in looking at this one because it's topical, is to also think about what are next steps. And that's certainly the last thing that you want to think about when you just finish the book. It's like someone asking you, what are you working on now? But the question is, what's left to do, both scholarship and within churches, or in what kinds of other things would this book serve as an incentive for further conversations and for further academic work? What's left to be done? And a lot, but I wonder if either of you would like to say something about any new ideas or things that came from having looked at the volume that finally we are able to hold in our hands.
I would just say briefly, I think that because there's such a great range of contributors and folks from different academic disciplines, that I think it is a really great way for people to maybe just dip their toe in a little bit. There are lots of different places where you could begin. You don't have to read the book from start to finish, but flip through, check out the table of contents, see what's appealing, look there, look at the end notes, see what's there. I think in terms of what's left to do, I would start with getting this into the hands of people who are interested, who are curious, who want to know more, and helping them to find resources to answer some of the questions that they have. On Twitter, there's always a conversation and someone will say, Google is free. But plenty of people don't have access to information the way that often I think folks in academia think that they do. So giving people a place to begin is, I find, one of the things that we can do that's really helpful. And this is a book that's at a reasonable price point, unlike most of our academic books. And if you think about it, you can also consider asking your local library to purchase it. And I think just getting it into the hands of folks is one of the ways that we can move forward.
I certainly agree with that. And I would also include in that denominations, that we actually, how can we get it to church people, broadly construed, even those who may be uncomfortable with all or parts of it. But what kinds of conversations can the book be used to generate? Cheryl Sanders posted a question, which I think is a really good one. Have you considered producing a video that illustrates how the ideas and the messages about sexuality that are in the book could actually find expression in an actual congregation or in actual congregations? And we get some sense of how those conversations have gone on, certainly in the work that the Wileys did in their church, particular church in Washington, D.C., and that's captured in the last interview in the book. But that's part of what I've been thinking about too, is how can we get this into churches? It's written in a very accessible style. I would say that even the academics, who are not always able to do that, but between the academics and the preachers and others here, it really is a book that's readable and that people can take a great deal from. So thank you for that, Cheryl. But have you given any thought to any kind of multimedia presentations, Josef?
So I guess a couple of things, right? So the center is still working. It's working in this area as well as on a range of broader issues at the intersection of Black studies and the study of religion. And things we've been talking about is one of the things we have been talking about is around the sort of multimedia history of these questions in a sort of longer arc, right? That might run back through folks like Bayard Rustin, might run back through someone like Clarice Cobb, right? Is to really actually tell, I mean, this is something we've talked about in the context of the work. When we inherited this project 10 years ago, there were already decades of folks fighting on the front lines in this regard, right? And so how do we actually document that story? And so one of the ways we've been trying to get more resources for is for work that documents that story, both through multimedia efforts, also through oral histories. I will say what is interesting, what I was excited to see in Henry Louis Gates's most recent coverage of the Black church is that Bishop Flunder is there, right? But makes a short appearance. But I think that just opens the door for a broader set of video media representations. I know that some future projects are in the works in that regard, and it would really be great to see some of the media makers out there tell that fuller story or resource that kind of documentary project. There have been some work in this regard already, but I think there still is much more that could be done in this regard.
And I would also say that the book can be useful to people who are not Black and not religious, but it may also be activists in all sorts of venues, including those who continue to have questions or misconceptions about the relationship between Black religion, Black sexuality, and the kinds of questions are dealt with in the book, which means I have a running list in my head of people I'm going to send this book to. So, and I say that as someone who's, whatever. So I won't give you my list, but let's just say your name might be on it. And we're coming up against time, but I want to see if there are any other questions here or any other general comments from anybody on the panel.
Barbara, I just want to speak
go
to
right
this
ahead,
about
Brad.
what's next. And I so appreciate you mentioning Dennis and Christine Wiley, because it prompts some thinking in me about what's next. And it gives me a chance to affirm the role of this book and our consultations in my own pastoral ministry. So a year after we had that first consultation, I helped to found the Open Church of Maryland, which is a radically inclusive congregation where we have roughly 50% of our congregation is LGBTQ, 50% is heterosexual, and our board of directors is, again, split right down the line. So I come to this conversation, again, not simply thinking about this at 36,000 feet, but I've spent now 11 years down on the ground. It's a small, funky, avant-garde congregation, but it is sure enough inclusive. And so the two C's that I would say are always at issue in terms of what's next. How do we use this book to, number one, incite curiosity, and number two, to promote courage? There are a lot of movable middle congregations and religious leaders who, if we could just nudge them to have the curiosity to move a little further and then take the courage to say, we are going to actually move towards more equitable and radically inclusive practices. And so I really appreciate the vanguard work that folks like Dennis and Christine Wiley have done, and hopefully we're following at the Open Church, that there are some of us who are literally doing this work on the ground and paradigms are being created. Curiosity and courage. Curiosity and courage.
I will hope that folks will take that to heart. And I'll also kind of circle back to Josef. Nyasha, do you have anything else you want to add at this point? We've got, some time, whatever might be on your mind.
I just want to mention again, there's a link to the book with a discount code. So please make sure that you check that out.
All right, so that's our commercial break. Thank you.
And I want to thank Nyasha over the long haul for helping to get me up to speed and how to use social media in this way, as she is so gifted and skilled in this regard. So both in publicizing this event and the book since it came out now about a month and a half ago. Well,
And
can I
just,
say, yeah, I got one thing about
I'll
next
give
thing.
you're good.
One thing that is about next steps, but is also about the past in the book. And this is also what I thought was so important about Nyasha's chapter, both in terms of connecting to the movement for Black lives, but also in figuring the experience of Black women and girls, right? Is the insistence that even as we're talking about, and this was sexuality, we were also already talking about gender and Black women's experience in the church. So, right, as we're making a claim and trying to create spaces that support full inclusion of Black LGBTQ folk, is also the recognition that there are still a significant amount of pulpits in which Black women cannot enter. And so how do we keep that broader set of conversations about gender and sexuality alive moving forward, right? I think is really just an important part of the conversation.
And I think it is a really important way to, as we move towards ending, to remember the significance and the importance of Black women in Black churches for whatever has been done and needs to be done and shall be done, and would just just kind of reiterate that, and also to remind us all that Black lesbians are often the most invisible people in the room, where whatever room there is. And so I think that that's also something that's really important for us to keep in mind. Josef, I want to thank you as we start to move towards time here. I think we have a few more minutes, but I really just to thank you again for your leadership and your constancy on this, and also for modeling the kind of cooperative collaboration that this has been for many, many years, and your willingness to really work under the broadest of umbrellas in terms of the kinds of conversations and people around the table. It certainly has been very, very rich in that way. And so I would ask you if you have any kind of concluding remarks here, and I'm going to read another question that's just come in if you want to say something.
Well, yes, I just would echo it and say I agree that the conversations in the space and how to hold together the difference that is represented by Black churches in the communities that they serve. That right now we've moved 2 or 3 decades beyond when, right, in the 1990s, scholars were turning to theories of postmodernism and post-structuralism to make a claim against the Black monolith. And now I think, right, one of the things that dovetailed or any monolithic ideas of all Black folk being alike, at the same time that this project was taking off, there was a similar conversation taking place, right? Following even your, right, one of the phrases in the first page of your second book, Barbara, right? That there is actually no such thing as the Black church, right? That the diversity that abides underneath that rubric is something much more complicated. And so how do we have that conversation and do this work and that attends to that difference? Recognizes that difference.
And that recognizes the innately idiosyncratic nature of most churches as well.
Absolutely.
This question I'm going to read quickly. I attended a large gathering of pastors and faith communities in New York on Saturday. The intent was to celebrate the contemporary history of the Pentecostal movement in New York. The segment on human sexuality was expectedly lazy and contrived. However, the amen from the millennials was hollow. I feel the need for more of an isolationist strategy. There are key Black leaders who are affirming or discerning, particularly the heavy hitting in terms of size, basically younger Black pastors, and he names Waldron and Coates and Haynes. Can we have a mass media moment in which those that have moved on the issue create a kind of a dramatic watershed moment, speaking to the schism in our thinking, which sends a signal to the Black church has evolved, is in the midst of an internal struggle that is dynamic and alive. And so thank you for that question, which will probably be our last question, but any comment on that?
Let me say first very quickly, thank you, Bishop Joseph Tolton.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Who's doing work on the continent in the on these very issues in service to the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries. I mean, I think one of the things that struck me and I was concerned about, but I think actually invites a new opportunity, is that, right, when the book was first imagined, there was by virtue of the debates around marriage, there seemed to be a certain kind of pressure that clergy had to say something one way or another. right? And that we're either for or against marriage equality. In fact, speaking up in the context of a campaign, right, at local and national level. With that conversation shifting, there isn't the same sort of, my sense, public attention often to the ways in which Black churches figure in this conversation. And so it may be the fact that the media isn't pressing on it in the same sort of way is actually an opportunity for a kind of conversation that reflects the complexity that doesn't show up in a debate around a legislative campaign, right? That it's either or votes yes or no, that this might be a space. And so I think the media opportunity is one way, but there might be other ways also that capitalizes on the kinds of things that I think Bishop Tolton is pointing us towards.
Yes, and Bishop, I apologize. It was an error not of my heart or my head, but of my progressive lenses here, just trying to read the small print in the Q&A. But thank you so much for that. And thanks to everybody who is here and has stayed with us and listening to this conversation, and really encourage you to take a look at this text and to appreciate the breadth of what it's trying to do. Even as I think this conversation is already very good. I think this conversation has already spurred us to think going forward about ways of getting the messages and the work in this book in a form that exceeds the text contained in this beautiful cover. So is there anything else that we should also now say or do, Josef? Matthew?
Well, yeah, I was gonna say, I think thank you again to
that's
IRCPO.
wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Savage, for that, and to all the panelists and the participants, the attendees, for those fantastic questions. And yeah, we're really grateful to be able to host this event and to have the book in the series, and we're looking forward to its wide reception. So thank you all very much for joining us this evening.
All right, so good night to everybody.
Okay. Good night,
Be
everyone.
safe, and thanks again for joining us. And I look forward to seeing some of you all in the, in the flesh here, so to speak. Okay, bye-bye.